My best friend, the one I trusted, sold my secrets to the boss and took my place. He had no idea I'd tear his life apart piece by piece. His job, his marriage, everything. My name is Alex. I'm 27 years old, and I've just lived through the most absurd day of my life. Imagine this. You get to work. Everything's routine. Coffee, a folder full of documents, colleagues who can't start a decent conversation. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, or so I thought. But then, half an hour later, the boss calls me in. No big deal, I thought. Just a standard work day. Or so it seemed. So I walk into his office, and there he is, looking at me like I just walked out of his worst nightmare. His expression practically screamed, "You owe me an explanation, Alex." I hadn't even opened my mouth when he blurted out, "Alex, I hate to say this, but you'll need to leave, right now." All right. I just froze. That whole "I hate to say this" sounded so insincere. It basically meant, actually, I enjoy saying this. I'm not stupid. Leave without knowing why? That's not my style. So I asked him, can I at least know what's going on? I've been working here for years. And that's when it got really interesting. This man with a completely straight face says, "Loss of trust. Your private messages with comments about the company reached us. Surely you understand we can't just ignore that." Whoa. I could feel goosebumps. Private messages? What messages? Am I crazy enough to openly discuss the company and my boss? Right then, I had a genuine reason to start wondering. Sitting there in the office, I realized everything felt too strange, too suspicious. Why didn't I know anything about these private messages? So I walked out of his office with that unsettling feeling, and the first thing I saw was Ben, sitting at my desk, discussing a new project with someone. My desk, my project, my job, and there he was, my friend, the guy I'd known almost my whole life, sitting in my chair like it was no big deal. I won't lie. In that moment, I had a few choice words I couldn't say out loud. Ben, we were like brothers. I would have trusted him with my deepest secrets. If I'd known this would happen, and then things started to fall into place. What if it was him? What if this friend decided to throw me under the bus, leak my personal messages to management just to make a way for himself? I didn't even know what would be worse, if it was true, or if I was just being paranoid. But one thing was clear. My life had just gone off the rails, and I was pretty sure it was because of the guy I'd considered my best friend. And that's how my personal hell began. I was fired, kicked out the door, and Ben, good old Ben, whom I'd known since childhood, was already sitting at my desk like he was born there. Let's be honest, it was the worst morning of my life. I went home, tossed my bag in the corner, and slumped onto the couch. You know how they say, sometimes you need a minute to take it all in? Well, I had a few hours, and it didn't get any easier. I kept thinking, how the hell did Ben pull this off? And so quietly, so smoothly, that I didn't notice a thing. At first it seemed unreal. Best friend, betrayal, job loss. Too twisted even for a TV show. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. This situation was so outrageous, it left no room for a calm reaction. My mind was already envisioning revenge scenes, showing up at the office with serious accusations. Of course, in reality, I was sitting on the couch with a slice of pizza, wondering how Ben managed to crack my password, because that was the only way he could have accessed my messages. So, he'd been digging around in my personal info. Now that is a betrayal, people. Imagine, the guy you shared meals and secrets with just goes and wrecks your career. All right, I realize the world doesn't respond to self-pity, so I decided to cool down a bit. Look at this with a clear head, I told myself, but the second I tried to think it's no big deal, I'd remember his smirk as he sat in my chair. And you know what's worse? I'd seen him in that chair before. We'd even joked about it, saying that if one of us ever led the department, we'd help each other out. Well, here was the help. Congrats, you're fired, so what next? I had two choices. Either sit and stew over his gift, or get myself together and start figuring out how to pay him back. Naturally, the second option sounded way more interesting. And no, These weren't just fantasies where I merely let Ben know he was wrong. No. That wouldn't be enough. I was thinking bigger. He wanted wins? Success at my expense? Well, I'd help him get exactly what he deserved. If Ben thought he was the smartest and could just disappear with my career, I had to show him I wasn't someone to mess with. He wanted my chair. Great, but he had no idea who he was up against. If he wanted to play big, I'd make sure he got that game, but on my terms. The first thing that came to mind was that Ben was married to a girl named Sarah. Oh yes, the perfect husband. Always showed up at parties with her, hand in hand, like they were in a commercial together. And they really did seem like the perfect couple with everything going for them. But I had a suspicion. When the facade is that polished, there are usually some cracks beneath the surface. I started small. I opened social media and made one of those fake accounts that people like Sarah always fall for. The kind where everything is flawless, the kind of account where every photo looks like the person drinks coffee in Paris every morning. Basically, I created the dream guy persona. And well, it worked. Within a couple of days, my new profile was already friends with Sarah. And not just friends, she immediately started messaging me. Turns out Sarah was quite the chatterbox. Right off the bat, she began talking about her life and, more importantly, how perfect everything was with Ben. Honestly, it was a bit dull until the interesting details started coming out. Apparently, Ben wasn't the prince he seemed to be. In reality, his perfect weekends with family were full of awkward moments, arguments, and unspoken tension. Once I realized that Sarah was craving attention, I started dropping hints like, "You deserve better," and "You need someone who truly appreciates you." It was like planting a seed and watching it grow, or, in this case, turn into poison. Every day, I eagerly waited for Sarah to come online. Over time, she started sharing such personal details about her marriage that it even made me feel uncomfortable. But I played the part of her best friend. And you know what I realized? Their so-called perfect marriage was hanging by a thread. Ben, as it turned out, wasn't much of a caring husband. He was all wrapped up in himself and his new job. Yeah, my former job. And he barely gave Sarah any attention. You know the funniest part? As I sat there carefully listening to her stories, I realized that this was the key to his downfall. All right, I had already laid the groundwork with Ben's personal life, but that was only half the plan, because honestly, one broken marriage wasn't enough for me. He took my job, so it was time to make sure that job became a one-way ticket to rock bottom for him. If he was so eager for my chair, let it turn into an electric chair. I decided to help him with his new responsibilities. A few days before I got fired, I'd been assigned a major project. Not just any project. This one was the kind where every wrong decision triggers a domino effect of small disasters. Ironically, this project was now Ben's responsibility, and I had an idea. If he was so keen on taking it over, why not give him a few friendly tips? First, I made a few calls to some former coworkers, carefully posing as a friend they hadn't heard from in a while, to find out how Ben was handling things. Turns out, he was already running into some issues. Well, it was time to give him a little assistance. I created a new social media account, styled as a cool business analyst, posted a few smart thoughts, and voila, I was in Ben's friend list. This time, it was easy. A couple of days later, he messaged me himself, saying it was great to connect and wanting to discuss the project. Oh, Ben, if only you knew who you were actually talking to. All I had to do was convince him he was speaking to a real expert. So when he started talking about his tasks and challenges, I gave him a few suggestions, ones that looked helpful on the surface but were guaranteed to cause a slow-motion disaster in the long run. For instance, I advised him to change the strategy. And to be honest, it was a fantastic plan, if you're looking to get yourself fired. Ben loved the idea, of course, and he rushed to implement it. I could almost see him confidently presenting to the higher-ups about how he was about to optimize the whole process. His boss, naturally, was all for it, as Ben sounded like he'd just discovered the secret to success. They even gave him additional resources and more time for implementation. Everything was going perfectly, because I knew the more time he spent on my strategy, the closer he was to total ruin. And then, a few weeks later, when the project was on the verge of delivering results, it began to fall apart piece by piece. Oh, it was beautiful to watch. I could almost picture Ben's face as he got asked questions like, "Why are we seeing losses here?" And "What happened to the plan?" Of course, he had no idea how to explain these unexpected failures. Ben was caught in the eye of the storm, and guess what? He had no idea how to escape it. With his career already starting to crack, I decided to hit him where it hurt even more: his finances. Ben had always been a big fan of showing off his successful life. New cars, stylish vacations, expensive restaurants, all funded by credit, of course, but who cares about that as long as you look cool? The idea was simple. I created a fake account, a so-called experienced investor, a couple of business-style photos, a few smart posts about finance, and suddenly, there I was, standing before Ben as an expert who knew all the right investment opportunities. Of course, Ben took the bait. Within a week, he was messaging me himself, asking where he could multiply his capital. I immediately fed him a secret startup that was supposedly on the verge of taking off, adding a few fake links to make it look convincing. Ben was convinced he'd hit the jackpot, and before long he invested a substantial amount in these fictitious assets. As expected, a few days later he started panicking when he couldn't access his investment account. "That's normal. Sometimes systems reboot," I assured him, saying it was just a standard procedure. He waited a few more days, and finally realized the money was gone. Now Ben was dealing with not only a work crisis, but also a financial one. Ironically, his own greed had done half the work for me. With his job in trouble and his finances in ruins, his life was already spiraling out of control. But something told me that wasn't enough. Ben had taken my career, set me up with the bosses, so just leaving him with shattered plans felt a bit too simple. I needed to make this truly painful so he'd feel it down to the core. And that's where Sarah, his perfect wife, came back into the picture. To be honest, getting Sarah on my side was easier than I expected. We'd already become friends through my fake account, and surprisingly, she quickly grew to trust me. We'd been chatting for a while, and it was clear she was starved for attention. It seemed she no longer believed in the fairy tale of her perfect husband. So, I decided to direct her disappointment in a certain direction. Through my fake account, I started planting seeds of doubt. I'd say things like, "You deserve more than someone who puts work above family." And guess what? She immediately agreed. She started confiding in me, talking about how Ben was always too busy with work, how he'd snap at her over the smallest things, how the only thing holding them together was their shared bills. The picture of the ideal marriage was crumbling piece by piece. But that wasn't enough, was it? I needed to pour gasoline on the fire. I decided to hint that her dear husband might not be as faithful as he seemed. I messaged her saying, "Are you sure he isn't seeing someone else? With guys like him, it's always work first, right?" She was shocked, but oh, how predictable. Soon enough, Sarah was checking his social media, his messages, trying to find any evidence. And I was savoring every moment, watching her trust in him dissolve, seeing her start to notice all the little things she'd previously ignored. A few days later, she messaged me, "You were right. Everything is falling apart." Oh, Sarah, you have no idea how right you are. By this point, Ben's life was unraveling at breakneck speed. At work, his reputation was slowly but surely crumbling. The projects were failing, thanks to my expert advice. He was beginning to realize he'd made a mistake. But I didn't stop there. No, I had the sense that this catastrophic spiral was only gaining momentum. As they say, time to reap what you sow. Imagine this: Ben arrives at work with the look of a man about to lose his last shred of happiness. I knew this because my former coworkers, still on my side, by the way, eagerly filled me in on the latest updates. It seemed the boss had started doubting whether Ben was even capable of handling the tasks, and was even considering assigning the project to someone else. But no, I didn't want him to just get fired. That would be too easy. I wanted him to stay and drown in his own mistakes, right down to the bitter end. Then I decided to add one more twist. I knew Ben had an important meeting coming up with a major client, one that was critical for us salvaging the project. So, once again, I reached out through my fake account and fed him a few brilliant ideas for the presentation. You know, ideas that sound fantastic in theory, but are disastrous in practice. Finally, the day of the presentation arrived. Ben walked into the meeting with his head held high, exuding a sense of confidence. Everything was perfectly prepared, except for one tiny flaw. His plan was riddled with so many complex, nonsensical details that the client couldn't make sense of it. Within minutes, Ben must have started to notice the room turning into a sea of skeptical faces. When the presentation ended, silence filled the room. Everyone was looking at Ben as though he'd just pitched a completely insane idea. The client said he'd need to think it over and left. Not 10 minutes later, Ben was called in for a talk with his boss. As I heard, it wasn't a pleasant conversation. The client backed out of the deal, and the company's reputation took a hit. So much for a successful deal. So now Ben had no projects, no respect from his colleagues, and no hope of salvaging the situation. Every move he made was under a microscope, and every step led to another failure. The company was abuzz with gossip about how Ben's project was a complete fiasco. And me? I was just sitting back, watching his career go down the drain. Fair, wouldn't you say? And now we come to the finale. Ben was left all alone on the battlefield, and honestly, he looked like a man who'd just been through a meat grinder. His work life was in ruins, his projects had fallen apart, and his bosses regarded him as little more than a nuisance. On top of that, his wife, Sarah, was just one step away from filing for divorce. Everything he touched was turning to dust. Who'd have thought it would come to this, right? The most ironic part was watching Ben try to pull his life back together. You know those people who, when everything goes wrong, suddenly decide to take control and start fresh. Ben was one of them. He tried, but it seemed he forgot he had no more cards left to play. One evening I saw him post something along the lines of, "You have to keep going no matter what. Life has its ups and downs." Oh, I couldn't help but chuckle reading that. Ups and downs. Ben, my friend, this isn't just a down. It's free falling off a cliff. And if only you knew who set up all those traps for you. In the final act, I decided to make a move he'd remember forever. Using the fake account of the friend he'd been trying to reconnect with, I sent him a message. "I heard things are tough for you right now. Maybe you should have treated your friends differently." He replied instantly, "You're right. I see it now, more than ever." I don't know if he realized who was behind all this, but the moment was too perfect. I could picture his face. Shock, a glimmer of realization, and of course, no way to change anything. In the end, Ben was completely destroyed. No job, a crumbling marriage, and all his friends had turned their backs on him. He had no idea where the blow came from, and that suited me just fine. Sometimes the best revenge is the kind no one ever suspects.